LBR LBO CEO Forum.
Platinum sponsor.
The happiness of coverage. The happiness of connectivity. The happiness of adventure. The happiness of being free. The happiness of endless joy. For unlimited happiness, Mobitel, we care, always.
Gold sponsor.
Every big dream needs a gentle push. Every unmapped tomorrow needs a warm embrace. Every ambition needs hope to take flight. At Sampat Bank, we make it possible. Today, tomorrow, and into the future. Sampat Bank, we present your future.
Silver sponsor.
BoardPack, the leader in iPad board meeting automation. A product by Iron One Technologies offered in partnership with Dialog Axiata.
Are you a busy board director, needing to review your board papers securely while on the move? Are board papers delivered to you securely? Are you finding it difficult to prepare for each board meeting? View meeting content. Interactive agenda. Read and annotate private notes. Approve paper and circulars. And much more. Join the prestigious clientele of BoardPack.
BoardPack, the leader in iPad board meeting automation. A product by Iron One Technology.
Lucerna SR is a meal replacement and low-calorie nutrition for people with diabetes. Triple Care, benefit when used along with standard diabetes management plan. Helps to manage blood sugar, supports heart health, helps reduce weight and waistline. Contains all essential ingredients. Will be appropriate as compared to micronutrients. From Abbott Nutrition USA, marketed by CIC.
For more information and nutritional advice, contact 0773 470 289 for more details.
I think this is probably the third time I've been involved in LBO forum, and it's a great pleasure as always. What I'm going to do is start with an overview of the state of the world economy, raise some key questions regarding the prevailing pessimism out there among academic experts and others about the future of the global economy, and then make some brief observations about the major economies, the United States, the European Union, China and India. And after that, really focus on the three mega trends of the global economy. First, global supply chains, how they affect this part of the world. Second, the energy equation, which is, at least for the next 20 years or so, a shift from scarcity to abundance. That means a big shift, not just in the economics of energy, the commerce of energy, but also the geopolitics of energy. And then finally, something I've become much more interested in due to a project I coordinated for the World Economic Forum, cities and urbanization. So let me start, like Lewis Carroll, with Alice in Wonderland at the beginning, and say a little bit about the global economic overview. If you look at, for example, the IMF's World Economic Outlook, what it tells us is that growth last year and growth this year will be around 3.5%. In the developed economies, we're talking of growth of less than 2% this year. What is interesting when you break it down is that the United States has returned as the motor of the global economy, at least from its western portion. So the United States is in the perhaps early stages of a post-GFC recovery. Growth will be about 2.5%, so it's forecasted in the United States. In other words, the United States, because of the flexibility of its economy, has actually been deleveraging from the crisis, shedding household and corporate, though not government debt, better than Europe and Japan. But, and this is the crucial but, this is the weakest recovery in the United States since the Second World War, which is why most Americans, and particularly Middle America, are not really feeling the benefits so far. So it's been a recovery with little extra job creation so far, and with inequality, income inequality actually widening since the global financial crisis. So that raises worrying questions about the US. The European Union is in a worse situation. It's not in recession, but growth is under 1% in the Eurozone in particular. All sorts of problems, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there are existential questions, not just for Europe, but for the rest of the world. There's a question mark over Grexit. Will Greece have to leave? I believe it will, sooner or later, perhaps sooner than we think. Will the United Kingdom leave the European Union after its referendum, either next year or in 2017, so-called Brexit? And what are the repercussions for the wider Eurozone? As I said, these are existential questions. If we look at Japan, growth is about what it is in the European Union, that is to say 1% or under. And so far, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's touted Abenomics has not worked. And I have always been quite skeptical about it. So it is supposed to have three arrows. There's a fiscal stimulus, there's a huge monetary stimulus, the biggest Japan has ever had, and there's supposed to be structural market reform. We've seen very little of the latter because it's politically most difficult. And so far, the macroeconomic stimulus has simply not worked in Japan. And there are existential questions about Japan's medium-term and long-term future, given the escalation of both public debt, it's about 250% of GDP, and demographics. Japan is an aging and shrinking population. If we look at emerging markets, it's much healthier. Growth on average about 4.5%, a bit down on before, but still very healthy. The really bright spots are developing Asia, growth of 6 to 7%, and interestingly, sub-Saharan Africa of about 5% growth. The less bright spots are Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East and North Africa. The bad news is that the big emerging markets have been slowing down considerably. So there's been no decoupling from the West. We are told that Chinese growth is 7 to 7.5% this year. Don't believe it, just as you shouldn't believe what we are told about the Sri Lankan growth numbers. There is actually quite a bit of similarity between the two stories. If you look at some of the micro data coming out of China, what the serious analysts will tell you is that growth in China is perhaps somewhere between 4 to 5.5%. In other words, 2% or more, less than the advertised growth number. And that's what people see with impressionistic eyes when they travel around the country, particularly when they look at the construction slowdown. Brazil is much worse. Brazil is now back in recession because the government has, I was about to use an F word, but let me not do that here. The government has messed up. It's a homegrown crisis. So typical wrong-headed interventionist economics, plus the downward spiral in commodity prices. Russia under President Putin has messed up even more, and Russia is not quite in free fall, but getting close to that for all sorts of reasons. India is a bright spot, probably will grow more than China, but again, you shouldn't believe the Indian growth numbers because they're also probably 1 to 2% less than what is advertised, given a cock-up in the way Indian statistics have been rejigged. So that's the broad story in emerging markets, particularly the big ones. Let me add one important thing, and this is again on a note of pessimism. International trade, which historically since the end of the Second World War and until the GFC grew at a faster pace than overall growth. So for the 30 years before the GFC, international trade grew at twice the rate of global growth, which is an indication that it leads, or is, if you like, an engine or a handmaiden to global growth. International trade in the last few years has actually lagged global growth. It's forecast to increase by about 4% or less this year. And that leads some analysts to worry about the future of globalization, because if trade is slowing down beyond the short term, that's seriously anxious news for the health of the global economy and for future growth. Now, all of this leads some eminent analysts to say some very pessimistic things, not just about what's happening now, 7 years plus since the GFC, but also what is going to happen beyond, into the 2020s, 2030s, and so on. So if you take Larry Summers, no need to explain who he is. He now talks of something called secular stagnation. And this is a revival of an old idea of John Maynard Keynes from the 1920s and the 1930s, which is not just that you have a dip in growth and employment because of a recession or depression, but that this will continue into the longer term because of a chronic lack of demand. Businesses basically are not turning savings into investment, employment, jobs, and so on. So you have that argument coming from Larry Summers. You have, in the wake of, the proper way to pronounce it is Thomas Piketty. To pronounce things in French, you have to purse your lips a little bit and move your hands around, even more than Sri Lankans do, until after a few drinks. But of course, now there are rising anxieties about widening income inequality around the world, even more so in the wake of Professor Piketty's book. And then thirdly, you have a number of analysts, some of them pop amateurs, some of them more serious, who argue that the new wave of technological change, automation, 3D printing, that sort of thing, is actually going to destroy jobs as well as widen inequalities. So it places a premium on those who are educated, professionals, and so on, and everybody else loses. Now, all of that paints quite a big picture around the world for the medium term, not just in the West, but outside the West. I don't share that pessimism, I must tell you, because I believe the problem is not demand management. I think Keynes was wrong then, beyond the short term, just as Larry Summers is probably wrong today. The problem is very much on the supply side. There are all sorts of bottlenecks and distortions in the West and in the rest, which prevent growth from taking off further, which prevent further increases in international trade and globalization, which prevent actually job creation in all sorts of ways. And if these can be addressed, however piecemeal, then I think there are reasonable prospects for a pickup in both growth and globalization around the world. One observation about all this anxiety about inequality. I don't want to dismiss it as a non-issue. That would be flippant and probably wrong, but I think it's overdone. It's overdone for several important reasons. Firstly, if you look at inequality among people around the world, it's declined sharply because so many people have been taken out of poverty, especially in China and India. Secondly, people talk about income inequality. That's what they mean. That's happening in some countries, but not in others. But they ignore other things. Education, for example, and the huge progress we've seen in education, particularly education of girls, tends to be an equalizing factor around the world, not a dis- or unequalizing factor. Consumption. I don't want to go into the detail here given our time constraint, but people around the world, rich, middle class, and poor, now are able to consume that much more with what income they have, hugely, not just in the West, but elsewhere. And then perhaps innovation is also something, the lack of it, is something that prevents new and better jobs being created. But my biggest worry is that all this griping about inequality is going to lead governments to undertake the wrong sort of policies that would cut off the well springs of growth, productivity, and entrepreneurship. That's what usually happens. There is one issue, however, where I have more time for the Larry Summers of this world. Larry Summers and a colleague, Lance Pritchett, published a paper last year arguing that we are not going to have a great convergence between the West and the rest. Now, historically, we didn't. We saw a great divergence between the richer countries and the poorer countries until about 1980. And then for 30 years, we saw actually a considerable convergence, with the poorer countries catching up faster and narrowing the gap with the West in aggregate. But Summers and Pritchett argue that this is perhaps just a blip on the screen. Over the last decade plus, there was the boost given by easy money, loose monetary policy, as well as high commodity prices for some countries. But that's come or coming to an end. Commodity prices are going in the other direction, and easy money is probably coming to an end as well, as we see with the beginnings of a turnaround in US monetary policy, and a probable rise in global interest rates, which among other things, of course, raises very worrying questions about debt financing for Sri Lanka from international capital markets. The crucial structural feature here, which Summers and Pritchett point to, is that of the middle income trap, which is not an illusion. The countries that have actually graduated from being middle income to high income are very few and far between. I think the number is about 5 to 7. Most don't. They get stuck in some sort of middle income space for all kinds of structural reasons. And that's a big issue for Malaysia and Thailand at the moment in Southeast Asia. It is a probable issue for China this decade and next. And if you look at the structural features of the Sri Lankan economy, probably an issue for Sri Lanka as well, but at a more premature stage of being lower middle income, if you look at demographics and all sorts of obstacles to growth. So that is, I think, something to worry about. Let me now move to the main economies, and again make some brief observations, not from the perspective of up and down economics, what's going to happen the day after tomorrow, but things that are perhaps more structural, where I'll stick my neck out a little bit. And let me start with the United States. The bad news about the United States is its macroeconomic picture, its fiscal policy and its monetary policy, associated with its monetary policy, the exchange rate, where you have a buildup of public debt and public expenditure which is wrongly shaped in all sorts of ways, lots of entitlements, especially for the middle class, which are simply not being tackled by Washington because of political gridlock in Washington. That's the bad news, and that's, I think, a kind of sword of Damocles hovering over the United States. But the good news is what is actually happening on the ground, more micro as it were, with the American economy, where, to put it in simplified terms, three things are happening that are not happening elsewhere on a significant scale. We are talking about a manufacturing revolution, an energy revolution, and an ongoing services revolution, which we don't see in Europe or indeed in other parts of the world. The advances in automation, which feed through into the transformation of production, are happening overwhelmingly in the United States. The energy revolution, which I'm going to talk about a little later, is happening almost exclusively so far in the United States, and it's not an accident. It's because of the nature of property rights when you come to drilling in the United States, and an overall entrepreneurial culture that is more developed than elsewhere in the West. And then finally, America has overwhelmingly the biggest number of world-beating services multinationals in the world, which are poised to take advantage of this rising middle-class phenomenon, the consumer phenomenon of Asia, as no other companies are in the aggregate. Now, when I make this point, I usually draw the distinction between Apple and Nokia. Apple is not a manufacturing company. These widgets that we all have, of course, they're goods, they're tangible. But the manufacturing is all, or almost all, outsourced. Apple is a services company, and it gets its value added from the services it has around this outsourced or offshored manufacturing, including a whole ecosystem of apps. Nokia never did that. It didn't make that transformation from a manufacturing company to a services company, so it was gobbled up by Microsoft. It's not just a Nokia problem, it's a wider European problem. Services are stunted in Europe for all sorts of reasons in the way that they're not in the United States. Now, I make those observations about those three things going on in the United States because one thing that makes the United States stick out from other developed economies, and certainly from developing economies, is that it has what economists call Schumpeterian or Promethean growth. American growth is much more than anywhere else of a big market, dependent on technological innovation and all sorts of other innovation. European growth is much more based on what is called Smithian growth. You need to expand the market. You need to open new markets so multinationals can go there. But it's based much less on innovation. So that innovation engine still exists despite the GFC and despite macroeconomic flaws in the United States. And that, I think, has huge, wider global ramifications. Because even though China has already overtaken the United States as the largest economy in the world, measured at purchasing power parity, which is probably the more accurate way of looking at it, and will overtake the United States as the biggest economy in the world in terms of market prices, that really doesn't tell us anything that important. It tells us China is big and has 1.3, 1.4 billion people. But if you look at qualitative factors of how economies perform, the United States is and will remain for the foreseeable future far ahead of China in all sorts of ways. And if the United States can get the macroeconomics right and provide a better framework to unleash more of this Promethean, this technology-oriented, innovation-led growth, there you have, I think, the basis for the United States to continue as number one for the foreseeable future. And being number one in the economic sense is the basis for the United States to lead the world in the political sense as well. So looking beyond the short term, I think this is important for Sri Lanka to bear in mind, because the United States is not going to go away. It is the most important market. Over time, it's going to become more important than Europe. The gap will widen. And that's important not just for the economics and commerce of Sri Lanka, but also security policy and the geopolitics of Sri Lanka. So do bear that in mind, please. I am much more pessimistic about the European Union. What we have seen since the GFC is virtually no serious market reform. We have seen nothing serious being done, least of all in Greece, but it's true of most of the other countries, with an equitable welfare state and a debt build-up that's not just about advertised numbers. It's also about unfunded public debt as a stock that has increased over time. If you add the deficits, for example, in pensions, healthcare, and social security systems to the flow of annual public debt, you come up with an average of about 450% of GDP in Europe. In Greece, it's 900%. I mean, these are actually quite a bit above American numbers and as alarming as Japanese numbers. We are seeing wider divisions within the European Union. We're seeing the rise of populist movements on the extreme left and on the extreme right. We're seeing a backlash against immigration at a time when Europe needs more workers, including low-income workers. And we're seeing Brussels really not doing anything substantial. And Europe being weak on the international stage, which we see particularly in relations with Russia, in all sorts of ways. Now, for me, there are three scenarios for Europe, looking beyond the short term. One is a kind of Japanese scenario of the two lost decades. So this combination of bad demographics and anemic growth will allow Europe to decline comfortably over the next couple of decades or so. But decline it will be. The more alarming scenario, which I would encourage you to think about, is that it's actually going to be worse than that in much of Europe, and particularly in the Eurozone, especially if the Eurozone breaks up beyond Greece. In that there will be a succession of crises which will only make European EU member states more inward-looking and turn away from the outside world, and even perhaps threaten the viability of the so-called European project, the European Union itself. Here I'm looking into the 2020s and the 2030s. I'm not saying it's a certainty, but I think it's certainly a possible reality. In other words, a scenario. But the bottom line here is this. The world is becoming more multipolar, but it is not moving away from the United States. It is moving away from Europe. Europe is still vitally important because it has critical mass, an even bigger market than the United States. But slowly but surely, the world is moving away from Europe to Asia Pacific, but the United States is still very much there as one of the anchors of Asia Pacific. China. What we are seeing is a structural slowdown in Chinese growth, from 10% to 7% or thereabouts in official terms, lower than that probably in reality. This is to be expected because the Chinese growth engine of the last 30 years has run out of steam. The demographics are going in the other direction, and throwing money through the financial system is yielding much more diminishing returns than in the past. In other words, China has to move to more productivity-led growth. And rebalancing, where they talk about more domestic consumption, less investment, less reliance on exports, more reliance on the domestic market, and to make the efficiency of investment better than it has been. Now, that's the backdrop to the big reforms announced during the third plenum in November 2013. President Xi and Prime Minister Li say they want to make a decisive shift to the market. They have announced their targets in outline. We have seen not much in the way of actual reforms. We've seen a few micro reforms here and there, particularly in the financial sector, but nothing major. So that raises, I think, two big questions about China for the future. One is, how much progress will the leadership make in the direction of these reforms which China sorely needs for better quality growth, more sustainable growth, given the huge vested interests against these reforms at the heart of the political system, the state-owned enterprises, the state-owned banks, government officials, and those 80 million members of the Communist Party all the way to the Standing Committee of the Politburo. That's one big question mark. I don't know the answer to that one, but I'm not a wild-eyed optimist. The second big question mark, I think, is more worrying, because it's about the nature of the Chinese political system, maybe not now or in this decade, but a decade to 15 years hence. This new kind of growth, more productivity and innovation-led, essentially needs more freedom for the individual in China and for the state to take more of a back seat, to be, if you like, more of an umpire than a player. But the state is a largely unreconstructed Leninist political system, and you have now in China a combination of Mao and markets. So the question to ask here is whether that is really viable in the medium term. And I have my serious doubts about whether a largely unreformed political system such as the Chinese one can deliver this better quality growth through the necessary reforms. If it can't, then we're all in deep trouble. Some final observations about our neighbor across the Pork Straits. I have a friend in Bombay who is from Kerala, and he makes the joke that he asks the question, what is the difference between India and Pakistan? Answer, South India. Think about it. The good news is that a very welcome change of government, replacing a hugely incompetent and utterly corrupt previous government, has certainly boosted confidence, and they've been lucky because oil prices have come down at the same time. So you have a boost to growth. Business is much more confident than it used to be. On the policy side, two good things have happened in the last year, and one not so good thing has happened in very broad terms. The two good things that have happened are these. Firstly, Mr. Modi is an ex-chief minister. You don't have to explain to him the virtues of decentralizing power to states and municipalities, because then they can engage in all sorts of experiments and overcome political blockages which exist in Delhi. So he is doing that in a significant way. One example of that is the incipient reform of labor laws in Rajasthan. So that is good news. We'll see more experiments, 100 or 1,000 flowers blooming, if you like, around this vast continent, in effect. The second bit of good news is that he is now transposing what he did in Ahmedabad to Delhi. So you have a revamped Prime Minister's office. He insists that civil servants do a regular working day rather than having very long lunches and spending their afternoons on the golf course. It's bad news for golf links in New Delhi. And he gives them performance targets. And you already see some changes in the pipeline. The government, in its low-key way, is actually doing some serious things about making approval procedures more regular, more automatic, and less subject to bureaucratic discretion. They are having some success in clearing a lot of a backlog of investment projects, that, including some very big ones, that were delayed by the Environment Ministry in particular. And at the same time, you have, I think this is very important, transparent auctions on coal and telecom spectrum, which didn't happen under Congress. So a further rollout of these kinds of reforms, I think, are very important to India, but I think have some very important lessons for us. Because if the government, whatever it's going to be after the election, is looking for some quicker wins with relatively simple policy changes, as opposed to the more complicated ones that will be politically more difficult. There is a lot to learn from what Mr. Modi has done in the past year. And it's basically about giving politicians and bureaucrats less room for discretion to be incompetent or corrupt or both, and giving more clarity and predictability to the investor, whether he or she be domestic or foreign. The bad news is that we haven't seen any really big policy reforms in India, in land, in the labor market, in infrastructure, and so on, where the government has been timid. And that leads one commentator, Arun Shuri, former newspaper editor and government minister, to say that in India, 1 year after Mr. Modi was elected, when all is said and done, less is said than done. That's my broad coverage of the global economic scenario. Let me now move to these three mega trends that I pinpointed. There are, of course, others out there, but these are the ones I think I'm more interested in. And let me start with global value chains or global supply chains. And to try and simplify it, up until 30 years ago, when multinationals went abroad, they largely went abroad to serve the local market, and they put in place, like you see, for example, with Glaxo in Moratuwa off the Galle Road, a production site that just serves the local market and replicates what they do in other markets. What we've seen as a result of technological changes as well as big policy changes, liberalization, is companies like Glaxo, they continue to do that kind of thing, but in their key markets, they do something different. So with some of the pharmaceutical majors based in Singapore, they have a regional headquarters operation which coordinates through some pretty complex logistics, different production sites in different markets around the world that are linked together through trade in parts and components. In other words, a supply chain or a value chain. It's fragmented, but it's brought together through all kinds of advanced logistics. Now, the research on international trade recently tells us that this global supply chain phenomenon, a different kind of international trade, driven by foreign direct investment, where multinationals are the system integrators, as it were, is one of the biggest drivers of employment, of productivity and growth in the world, especially when it comes to international trade. It's the biggest chunk of manufacturing trade in particular, about 2/3 of it. You see its core in ICT production. East Asia, for example, has 2/3 of global ICT trade. But you see it increasingly in many, many services as well. But it's not dispersed around the world. It's in 3 regional cores, in North America, in Europe, and in East Asia, but not South Asia. And within this context, there are 3 big things happening. The first is this. With this supply chain phenomenon, you now have a much closer connection, integration between imports and exports. The figures coming out are truly astounding. On average, to export, your imported content is about 30 to 40% around the world. In some countries, it's much higher, particularly smaller countries, but not Sri Lanka. Second phenomenon is that this is very much not just about manufacturing, it's about services. This is really key. The international trade figures tell us that services, if you look at the balance of payments, is about 20 to 25% of GDP. In reality, if you measure the value of what's actually produced in particular locations, it's more like 50% or above. In other words, services is becoming hugely important, not only in and of itself, but also as something existential for manufacturing. And we're talking in particular of a whole cluster of financial services, a whole cluster of business services, including the law, accountancy, and so on. And we are also talking about transport and logistics. And the third phenomenon about global supply chains, I forget for the moment. I'm sure I'll remember it. Now, what are the implications of this? The first one is really about how this map of global supply chains might be about to change. You have the pessimists who argue that we are actually going to see the end of the golden age of supply chains because supply chains are going to shorten or recenter. Globalization is slowing down. Finance is being renationalized. In other words, more national cordons of regulation around finance to prevent it from becoming more global. And the kind of secular stagnation and other things that Larry Summers talks about. And in addition to that, you have people who say that we're going to see more recentering or reshoring of manufacturing in the United States, and also the Chinese, crucially, bringing more of the value added into China and more reliant on national supply chains than regional or global supply chains. In other words, centralizing forces or centripetal forces. But my gut feeling is that the decentralizing or centrifugal forces are actually going to outweigh these recentralizing forces in the future with the aid of technology and with the aid of liberalization. Why do I say that? I say that for a sectoral reason as well as for a geographical reason. Sectorally, there is huge potential to expand these supply chains from its core in ICT into lots of other areas of manufacturing and into many, many areas of services as well. So all of that lies ahead. The opportunities are there, I think, to exploit. And the second reason is geographical, because there is the potential clearly out there as low-cost production migrates out of the 10 coastal provinces of China, which it is doing, for other countries to benefit at the lower end of the value chain. So you see that happening in the interior provinces of China. You see that happening to some extent in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in the future perhaps Myanmar, Bangladesh. But the really big prize here is India. It's not happened so far, but if you do see some policy changes in the land market and the labor market in particular in India, you will probably see a huge rush, not a huge rush, but in the aggregate over time, a considerable migration of these supply chains where the low-cost end will be done in India, and that in effect is the shadow of what has happened in China over the past 30 years. Now, I think that the big implication for Sri Lanka here is if and when that happens, however piecemeal, Sri Lanka has to be in a position to exploit its niches or tasks in those value chains. They will mainly be in the 4 states of southern India. They will overwhelmingly be in services, in various services niches. In other words, in some kind of middle bracket between low-cost India and higher middle-cost Malaysia and elsewhere. Let me say something about the policy implications of global value chains. The logic of a global value chain is to liberalize and keep the market open and keep things as simple and as competition-oriented as possible, because you want a seamless flow. You do not want the government pretending to be omniscient and pretending to be clean and competent to have all kinds of industrial policy interventions that prevent these value chains in the country from forming and expanding. What investors are looking for when they look at individual countries for certain niches along these value chains is a whole package of policies. It's not just the traditional policies of liberalizing your tariffs and quotas at the border, of having a freer flow of foreign investment coming in with fewer complications. But that's important. But beyond that, it is about a whole host of domestic regulations, including protection of intellectual property, including making the business climate cleaner and simpler. I talked a little bit about that with reference to the Modi reforms in India, that are really about economy-wide measures that benefit domestic traders and domestic investors alongside foreign traders and foreign investors. And broadly speaking, it's that kind of package that allows a country to insert itself and then expand in value chains. And that, again, I think has huge implications for Sri Lanka. The problem with policy here and around the world, in some countries worse than others, is that policy is almost totally disconnected from this unfolding late 20th century, early 21st century reality. So here, as elsewhere, one thinks in terms of imports and exports in two separate compartments with two separate sets of policies. And where you get to the point of, if you'll excuse my French or Greek, buggering up your imports, but thinking at the same time you can expand your exports. It just doesn't work that way, on theoretical as well as on the grounds of hard facts. It's not happening in the WTO, which has a 20th century agenda in the Doha round. It's not happening in most of the FTAs either, including CEPA. The only FTAs that really take supply chain seriously are the American ones. And even with them, there are problems. So I think a lot of implications for Sri Lanka there. My second megatrend, let me try and abbreviate this somewhat, is really about energy. We are going to see, if the forecasts from the International Energy Agency and BP and others are right, a doubling of energy demand and consumption in developing Asia in the next 20 years or so. So Asia is going to move to the center of energy consumption, if not energy production. And that's going to require between $20 to $30 trillion of infrastructure to make it happen. 75% of this is going to come from traditional fossil fuels. So there is no way around oil, gas, and coal, right? In addition to renewable energy sources. But renewable energy, I've said this before and I'll say it again, is not the panacea, it's not the quick fix, and there are lots of silly policies regarding renewable energy around the world. Now, some of this increased demand is going to come from some Asian countries, like Australia and Indonesia in coal, Australia and Mongolia in iron ore, oil and gas from Malaysia, and so on. But it's not nearly enough to cater for this increasing demand. So most of this increasing demand is going to have to come from outside Asia, much of it probably from the Middle East, and it travels along energy lanes on the sea and through choke points, which have since ancient times been centers of conflict, including violent conflict. And those include the Straits of Malacca. About 40% of Asian trade goes through there. Now, two things to bear in mind in terms of policy. Firstly, energy markets around the world are even more throttled than they are in finance. Price controls, very wasteful subsidies to fossil fuels, blocking blocking foreign investment, blocking having export restrictions, a lot of state-owned incumbents or private sector monopolies. And some progress has got to be made in marketizing or liberalizing a lot of that if the supply of all this new infrastructure is going to actually meet this huge increase in demand. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is really about the geopolitics of all this. What we are seeing in the seas, in particular in Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in the Southeast Asian archipelago, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, is an increasing strategic competition at two levels. One is between the established power, the United States, which is Asia's key balancing power, and China, the rising power. Another is between China, Japan, and India. And both these levels of strategic competition are about energy, natural resources, securing energy supplies, and in the water, in the seas. And there are no rules around all of this. It's very much about a balance of power, which raises very worrying concerns and perhaps a parallel with Europe 100 years ago. So I think this again raises big questions for policy here about energy supply, security of energy supply, and how relations on energy and of course wider issues are managed as between the Americans, the Chinese, and the Indians in particular. Finally, let me come to my last of the three megatrends, and it's about cities and urbanization. I chaired the World Economic Forum's Competitiveness Council last year, and we put together a fairly big report on the competitiveness of cities. The forum does an annual report on the competitiveness of nations, but we thought that we would disaggregate it as a starter to the competitiveness of cities. And we had about 35 case studies from around the world. The report is on the web, on the forum website. Do take a look at it if you're interested. We have interesting cases from cities around the world, including probably about 15 from East and South Asia. Hence my interest in the topic. I'm not an urban economist. Now, the big megatrend here is urbanization. People moving from the countryside to established as well as new towns and above all cities. And just to throw a few figures and numbers at you, in 2010, for the first time in the history of civilization, more than half the world's people live in cities. And the UN tells us that by 2050, it'll be about 2/3. Another 2.4, 2.5 billion people will urbanize. In China, it's already close to 55% of the population. It'll be about 60% by 2020. India is far behind. Urbanization in India is about 1/3 of the population. But behind that figure is the much more interesting fact that about 200 million Indians have urbanized since the reforms began in the early 1990s. And there's much more to come, of course. McKinsey Global Institute has done a series of very interesting studies on urbanization. They're well worth looking at. Let me pick out one or two highlights. They have a list of the top 600 cities in the world. By 2025, China will have about 250 of them. And India will have about 50. China plus South Asia will account for about half the total. We'll see a few more megacities with a population of 10 million or more. But the real big boost to growth is going to come from so-called middleweight cities. Cities with a population of 150,000, which is small, and 10 million. And the main bracket is between 5 million and 10 million. The biggest growth is going to come from these cities. They're overwhelmingly outside the West. Interesting little number, 94% of the urbanization we are going to see over the next 2 decades is going to come from outside the West. In other words, the West is almost completely urbanized already. And these middleweight cities are the repository of this burgeoning, emerging middle class. According to MGI, these are people who earn between about $10 and $100 a day, purchasing power. And we're going to see an additional 1 billion of these people or thereabouts. So these are some of the big trends out there. What are their implications? Well, first, in addition, we are accustomed these days, since the Treaty of Westphalia, 5 or so centuries ago, to think of a map of the world that's divided into nation states. And that continues to be important. But before the Treaty of Westphalia, we were largely accustomed to thinking about a map of the world that was disaggregated into cities or subregions. And I think it's worth looking at that map again, only of course under 21st century conditions of the kind of urbanization I described. In other words, a world of cities. One thing that hasn't changed is that the biggest number, as well as the most intensive and productive transactions around the world, are those that take place among cities, not between the city and the hinterland. And still, as before, most of those cities are actually on coastlines. And they trade with each other to a very large extent. 80% of international trade by volume is still across the seas. So that, I think, has important implications over here, to think of economic development not just in terms of the nation dealing with other nations, but also cities and regions dealing with other cities and regions around the world. And these are also nodes of global supply chains and production networks. That's my tour d'horizon, as it were. As you see, I've been very macro on a number of fronts, and I look forward to hearing from fellow panelists about what they think are the implications of this and many other things for Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
LBR LBO CEO Forum.
Platinum sponsor.
Superior online gaming. HD video streaming. Fastest download speeds. Contactability. The fastest growing mobile 4G LTE network in Sri Lanka. Mobitel, we care, always.
Gold sponsor.
Every big dream needs a gentle push. Every unmapped tomorrow needs a warm embrace. Every ambition needs hope to take flight. At Sampat Bank, we make it possible. Today, tomorrow, and into the future. Sampat Bank, we present your future.
Silver sponsor.
Board Pack, the leader in iPad board meeting automation. A product by One Technologies offered in partnership with Dialog Axiata.
Are you a busy board director, needing to review your board papers securely while on the move? Are board papers delivered to you securely? Are you finding it difficult to prepare for each board meeting? View meeting content. Interactive agenda. Read and annotate private notes. Approve paper and circulars. And much more. Join the prestigious clientele of Board Pack.
Board Pack, the leader in iPad board meeting automation. A product by One Technology.
Glucerna SR is a meal replacement and low-calorie nutrition for people with diabetes. Triple Care, benefit when used along with standard diabetes management plan. Helps to manage blood sugar, supports heart health, helps reduce weight and waistline, contains all essential ingredients, will be appropriate as compared to micronutrients. From Abbott Nutrition USA, marketed by CIC.
For more information and nutritional advice, contact 0773 470 289 for more details.